There are people in this world who become famous, and somewhere along the way lose the thread of who they actually are. The fame swallows them whole, and what is left is a performance, a version of a person polished for public consumption. Mark Consuelos was never that kind of person. Even after decades in the entertainment industry, even after years of morning television, even after building a life that millions of people watched and admired from a distance, Mark remained something rare in his world. He remained himself. That is not an accident. That is not luck. That is the result of something that was built long before any camera ever found him. Something that was constructed quietly, without fanfare, in the home he grew up in, and through the example of the people who raised him. And when you understand where Mark Consuelos came from, not the career, not the television appearances, but the actual foundation of who he is, then what happened to him at the age of 55 hits entirely differently. It stops being a celebrity headline. It becomes something deeply, unmistakably human. To understand what Mark lost, you first have to understand what he had. And what he had, at the very core of everything, was a father who knew exactly how to shape a son without ever making it feel like shaping at all. Mark's father was not the kind of man who commanded a room by being loud. He did not need theatrics or grand speeches. The influence he carried over his son was the quiet kind, the kind that works slowly over years, the kind that a person only fully understands long after it has already done its work. What that father passed down was not complicated in its description, but it is extraordinarily difficult to actually live. Discipline without cruelty. Loyalty without conditions. The understanding that showing up for the people who depend on you is not optional. It is simply what a man does. These were not lessons taught in formal conversations. They were lessons visible in the way Mark's father moved through daily life, in how he handled setbacks, in how he treated the people around him, in the steady and unspectacular reliability he offered to his family every single day. Mark grew up watching that. He grew up absorbing it the way children absorb everything important, not through instruction, but through observation, through proximity, through the repeated experience of watching a good man do good things for no reason other than that it was right. And it stayed with him. Through the auditions and the early career, through the years of building something from almost nothing, through the moments of genuine success and the pressures that come with maintaining it, those lessons from home came along for all of it. They were not loud. They did not announce themselves. But they shaped every decision he made and every version of himself that he chose to show to the world. It is why Mark never seemed particularly seduced by the more destructive temptations of celebrity. While others in his industry drifted toward excess, Mark kept his circle tight. He stayed grounded in a way that people noticed, in a way that seemed almost counterintuitive for someone with his level of public profile. He was not boring. He was not disengaged. He simply had a center of gravity that the entertainment industry could not pull him away from. And that center was everything his father had quietly installed in him over a lifetime. That is the kind of father worth grieving. Not just a parent, but the original architect of a person. Not just someone who was present, but someone whose presence became the blueprint for everything that followed. Losing a parent is one of the experiences that sits in a category entirely by itself. It is not like other losses, even significant ones. It carries a weight and a texture that is different, something that anyone who has been through it recognizes immediately, and that is almost impossible to adequately explain to someone who has not. When Mark lost his father, the grief was immediate and enormous, but it was also layered in the way that grief from this particular kind of loss always is. There was the simple, direct pain of absence. The person was there, and now the person is not, and that fact is too large and too strange to process quickly. But beneath that there was something else, a whole landscape of meaning and memory that suddenly shifted the moment the loss became real. Memories that had once felt ordinary became unbearable in their weight. A conversation that had seemed unremarkable at the time, just two men talking, father and son, returned to Mark's mind with a significance it had never carried before. Advice that had been offered casually, absorbed without deep reflection, suddenly revealed itself as something precious. Moments from years ago, decades ago, moments he had not thought about in a long time, began surfacing constantly, arriving without invitation, arriving with the particular sting of things that are finished and can never be added to. That is the cruelest specific detail of losing a parent. The relationship does not just end. It freezes. Everything that was ever said between them, every moment they ever shared, every exchange in silence and ordinary interaction across an entire lifetime together, that becomes the complete collection. Sealed. Unchangeable. No new memories to be made, no conversations still waiting to happen. No more ordinary moments that would have seemed unremarkable in the present, but invaluable in retrospect. Mark was left holding that collection, carrying it in the way that private grief is carried, quietly and with enormous weight. There is something that happens when loss of this scale enters a person's life. It does not just bring sadness. It brings clarity, a brutal and unwelcome kind of clarity that cuts through all the noise and all the distraction and forces a reckoning with what is real and what is not. For Mark, that clarity brought with it a question he had perhaps not allowed himself to sit with fully before. In all the years of building a career, of maintaining the pace and the demands and the relentless forward motion that the entertainment industry requires, had enough of his actual self been given to the person who mattered most? Had the pull of professional life created distance that nobody chose and nobody noticed until it was too late to go back and reconsider? This is a question that does not have a clean answer. Mark had always been someone who understood and genuinely valued family above almost everything else. That was not performance. That was real. But valuing something and being fully, consistently present for it are not always the same thing. And the machinery of a long career in a demanding industry has a way of making the gap between them invisible until something forces you to look directly at it. He was not alone in this. This is an experience shared by an enormous number of people who have lost a parent while in the middle of busy lives. The grief and the regret arrive together, intertwined, impossible to fully separate. The loss is devastating on its own. The questions it raises about time already spent make it worse. Mark sat with those questions. He could not escape them, and perhaps he did not try to. There is something honest in allowing that kind of grief to be what it actually is, rather than rushing past it toward recovery or resolution. He was changed by it, and he knew it, and he did not pretend otherwise. The world watching from outside saw someone who was handling things. Mark Consuelos continued to show up, continued to meet his responsibilities, continued to move through public life in the steady and composed way that had always defined him. There was nothing on the surface to suggest the scale of what was happening underneath it. But composure is not the same as peace. Keeping it together on the outside while carrying enormous grief on the inside is its own form of exhaustion, one that is difficult to see and even more difficult to measure. For someone like Mark, who had spent a lifetime processing things internally rather than externalizing them, the grief had nowhere to go. It sat. It accumulated. It became a weight that ordinary daily life had to be carried on top of. The small reminders were often the hardest. A habitual moment in the day that had always involved his father now had nothing to attach itself to. A reflex that had been built over decades, the instinct to call, to check in, to share something small, suddenly leading nowhere. These are the details that grief lives in, not in the grand gestures of loss, but in the thousands of tiny ordinary moments that now carry an absence inside them. The people closest to Mark could see what others could not. Behind the composure was a man who was genuinely exhausted, genuinely hurting, and carrying far more than the outside world had any window into. His public face remained intact because Mark ensured it did. But that effort itself was costly. Maintaining the appearance of steadiness while experiencing the opposite underneath is work that wears a person down in ways that do not show up immediately, but accumulate over time. In the middle of all of it, there was Kelly. Kelly Ripa has been at the center of Mark's life for long enough that she knows him in the particular and irreplaceable way that only comes from decades of genuine, lived-in partnership. She knows the difference between his versions of fine. She knows when the composure is real and when it is something he is maintaining for other people's benefit. She knew what was happening, and she had no interest in pretending otherwise or in giving him the space that can sometimes look like support but actually functions as distance. What she offered Mark during this period was not dramatic. It was not performative. It was a kind of support that rarely gets described well because it does not come with visible gestures. She stayed close. She was present without demanding anything from that presence. She sat with him in the silences without needing to fill them. She checked in without pressure, without requiring him to produce a progress report on his grief, without making him feel that his pain was a problem to be solved on a timeline that would make other people more comfortable. There is a particular skill in supporting someone who grieves quietly, who does not reach outward when they are hurting, who will manage on the surface regardless of what is happening inside. It requires the other person to be perceptive enough to see past what is being shown and secure enough to offer presence without needing acknowledgement for offering it. Kelly did exactly that. She also gave him something he may not have known he needed until she offered it. By simply being there, by refusing to treat him as someone who had things handled when he clearly did not, she gave him permission to stop pretending. She made it possible, without saying a word about it directly, for the grief to exist fully rather than being managed down into something more socially acceptable. That kind of permission is enormously valuable and more rare than it should be. Mark leaned on her, perhaps more heavily than he had ever leaned on anyone before. And she held that without hesitation, without making him feel reduced by needing it, without once suggesting that his grief was too much or too heavy or going on too long. That is what a genuine partnership looks like when something genuinely terrible has entered it. Not inspiration or resilience rhetoric. Just one person staying close while another person finds their way through something that cannot be rushed. Grief of this scale does not pass through a person and leave them unchanged. It settles somewhere. It becomes part of the internal architecture. And what it left in Mark was visible to anyone who knew him well, not as damage, but as a different way of moving through the world. He became more reflective, less caught up in the urgency and the noise that had always surrounded the work, more willing to let things that had once felt important recede to their actual size when placed against what genuinely mattered. The career achievements, the recognition, the professional momentum, none of it disappeared, but all of it looked different through the lens of what he had just been through. He became more present with the people still around him, his wife, his children, the connections that had always been central to who he was, but that loss had now made impossible to take for granted. He stopped moving through those relationships at the pace the rest of his life demanded. He slowed down, paid attention, showed up not just physically, but actually fully, in the way that grief teaches you to show up when it has made clear what the cost of not doing so eventually becomes. There is a kind of wisdom that can only come through loss. It cannot be arrived at through success or through effort or through any amount of time spent thinking about it in the abstract. It has to be lived specifically and painfully and personally. Mark lived it. He came out the other side not broken but changed, and the change was the kind that, once it happens, does not reverse. He stopped waiting. That might be the most important thing. The understanding that the right moment is never guaranteed, that the people who matter cannot be attended to later, because later is not promised, settled into him in a way that it had not before. His father's absence made that concrete, not as a philosophy, as a fact. When word of a loss spread, something interesting happened in the response. It did not move through the usual cycle of celebrity sympathy, the brief acknowledgement followed by the rapid return to whatever came next. People paused. People felt something real. Mark Consuelos had been a familiar face for long enough that a particular kind of connection had formed between him and the people who had watched his life from a distance. Not the parasocial intensity that sometimes attaches to celebrity, but something quieter and more genuine. Over years of being visible, of being present on morning television alongside his wife, of allowing glimpses of a family life that seemed genuinely warm and unperformed, he had become someone audiences felt they actually knew. Not as a character, as a person. And when a person you feel you know experiences something universally painful, the response is different than the response to a stranger. People connected his loss to their own. They shared their own experiences of losing a parent, found in his story something that had nothing to do with fame or television or any of the markers of celebrity life. They found the recognizable human experience underneath all of it. That is what happens when grief is handled honestly. It stops being about who the person is and starts being about what they are going through. And losing a parent is one of the few experiences almost universally shared across human life. Nearly everyone either has faced it or knows that they will. Mark's loss reminded a lot of people of their own, and in doing so it connected him to the people watching not as a celebrity to a fan base, but as one human being to another. The things loss teaches are not gentle. They do not arrive with softness or consideration for timing. They come in through the wound that grief opens, and they settle there permanently, unavoidable and honest. What Mark was left with, after moving through the worst of what his father's passing had put him through, was a clarity about the nature of time that he had not possessed before and could not have acquired any other way. Time moves whether you are paying attention or not. The people who shaped you into who you are will not always be there. No amount of success, no quantity of achievement, no level of public recognition can slow any of that down or buy back a single moment that was not spent the way it should have been. Fame, it turns out, is a strange insulator. It can make a person appear untouchable, as though the ordinary heartbreaks of life have been somehow redirected away from them by the force of their visibility. But they have not. They never have. The ordinary heartbreaks find everyone. They arrive on the same schedule regardless of a name being carried into them. Mark Consuelos at 55 was a clear and quiet demonstration of exactly that. Underneath the career and the television appearances and the familiar face that millions of people had grown comfortable seeing, there was simply a man going through one of the hardest things a person can experience. No insulation, no protection, just the loss and the grief and the work of carrying it. What remained on the other side of all of it was not just a sadder version of the man he had been before. It was a version more awake to what his life actually contained and more deliberate about the way he moved through it. His father had shaped him quietly and completely over a lifetime, and losing that father had shaped him again in different ways, adding a layer of understanding that only that kind of loss can give. The story of Mark Consuelos is not really a celebrity story. It is a story about fathers and sons, about time and what it takes, about grief and what it teaches, and about the quiet but unbreakable ways that the people who raise us live on inside everything we do, long after they are no longer there to see it. At 55, Mark was not just mourning a man. He was reckoning with the full weight of everything that man had meant, and discovering, as so many people have discovered before him, that some absences never fully fill back in. They just become part of the shape of who you are.